All right, joining us now is Chris Johnston of NorthStar Bets. It's time for Inside the NHL. Chris, you were just in Palm Beach, Florida, at the GM meetings. A lot talked about. At the top of the list was the cap and whether or not it was going to go up. What's the latest on the cap going into next season?
Well, kind of an interesting takeaway, actually. Essentially, when the pandemic hit, the players and owners made a new CBA. There's an extension to the previous agreement, and it was meant for the times. At that point in time, the players collectively basically went into debt to the owners because there wasn't much revenue coming in, but they continued to have their contracts honored. And as long as that debt remained, what the CBA said is that the cap can go up by no more than 1 million per season. Well, here we are approaching the end of this year, and it looks like what's going to be left of that debt is something in the range of 100 million, which has significantly been reduced in these past couple of years. And so there may be a negotiation on what next year's cap is. Maybe it isn't just 1 million. And so, that's a lot of preamble, but the point is to say that when Gary Bettman spoke with reporters at the end of the GM's meeting, I found it particularly interesting that he, indicated a willingness from the NHL's end to have that sort of negotiation or discussion with the NHL Players Association. It's an interesting time for the Players Union because they are welcoming a new leader in Marty Walsh. He actually officially starts next week in his role. And so maybe a little premature to forecast exactly where it's going. But, the takeaway is the GMs left the meeting thinking, hey, it's only going to go up, that being the cap, 1 million next season. And then Gary Bettman opened the door to maybe there's a way that it could be a little bit more than that, which would have a big impact on the industry because the salary cap has been relatively flat through these pandemic years. And it's, just been more complicated for teams to manage their rosters and then obviously less money for players to make come free agency.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned how the GMs have kind of been in flux with this flat cap. And then, of course, Gary Bettman opened the door to maybe even more than that $1 million cap increase. Just from an executive and a front office standpoint, how difficult and how much of an obstacle has it been for these guys to construct rosters, knowing that the cap has not really moved at all the last couple of years?
Well, players at the bottom end of rosters have really been squeezed in these last seasons. We've seen a number of established players take, way less money than I think they might have in the previous world, maybe more short-term contracts. And then even this crazy deadline period we've just come through where there was a lot of trades that the GMs and front offices did find a way to maneuver despite the choke on the system. But, how many trades did you hear, Team X is retaining 50% on this salary? Or, we had a number of transactions which a player was actually traded through a third team to have his salary retained twice. And that's not just because, GMs like setting fire to all their depth draft picks. It's because they needed to make those kind of moves in order to create the cap flexibility that was required in order to add players. So I think it has had a significant impact on the industry. I mean, look, at hockey's not the only one. The pandemic has affected a lot of different industries, and that's really what this is about. It's the echo from those seasons where games were played with no fans or very few fans in a lot of buildings around the league. And I think the good news is we're clearly getting to the end of that window. Even if the cap only goes up 1 million next season, by the time we get to 24-25 season, it's clear there's going to be a big jump, and then there's going to be more money flowing into the system, which means more money flowing into players' pockets, but also, more flexibility for the GMs to make trades and adjust their rosters.
Rule changes also discussed. Expanding overtime to 7 minutes was one of them being tested in the ECHL. How soon do you think that this can potentially be implemented into the NHL?
I think it could be as soon as next season. We have to see what becomes of the next step kind of the journey of how rules get changed in the NHL. Usually these ideas are kind of, I'd say the seeds are planted at the March GMs meeting. There's also a competition committee that meets in the spring that has players on it and GMs and assortment of NHL and NHLPA staff. So, perhaps now if it goes to the competition committee and they like the idea, then you get to the point where it's recommended as an official rule change. I don't know exactly how that's going to go, but it does sound like at least at the GM level that there is interest now in expanding overtime beyond 5 minutes. And look, there's some downstream consequences to this. Obviously, television partners will have a say in expanding that overtime period. There is a little bit more tax you're placing on your top players because generally in a 3-on-3 overtime setting, it's only the absolute top guys that are getting out there and seeing minutes. But, the goal clearly is to end more games in overtime, to reduce the impact of the shootout. I think the league's done that. Even by going to 3-on-3 overtime, we've seen a lot more games end in that period versus kind of the skills competition. of the shootout. And, when it was implemented into the ECHL, the numbers have borne out that with even just adding 2 minutes onto the end of the overtime period, you're much more likely to see the game end there. So, I think that there's a good chance that this change is coming. We'll just have to see sort of in the next stage if it's going to be a quick change and something for next season, or if it's maybe a little further down the line.
The playoff format was also talked about briefly by Gary Bettman, and basically said, "No, it's fine. It's working. We like it." How did the rest of the GMs react to that news from Bettman?
Well, put it this way. We're talking about it a lot more in the media or among fans on Twitter or even players than it appears anyone at the top levels of the NHL wants to talk about it. And that's because Gary Bettman doesn't think there's a problem fundamentally. He pointed out, and I'd say quite rightly, that if you look right now, if you did 1 versus 8 in the conferences, there isn't really that big a difference versus the current divisional playoff format they have. But, we've also had this season Sidney Crosby, Nathan McKinnon, and a number of other players. I think Bill Guerin, the Wild GM, has indicated he would prefer to go back to the 1 versus 8 system in conferences that we've had in the past. So you've had some pretty notable voices. It's not just people like myself banging a drum in the media for change here. But, at this point in time, I don't sense any appetite at the top ends of the league about it. GMs seem to be a little bit mixed. Certainly some of them don't seem to mind it too much. The current format don't see the need for change, but we're going to keep talking about it, and perhaps at some point, especially if I think if impactful players continue to have an opinion on this and voice it, I do think that there's a chance we see some change down the line, but it's not happening anytime soon. I didn't get the sense it was a big topic at all actually at the GM's meeting.
Expansion, another topic that was brought up during the meetings. Gary Bettman kind of shut it down pretty quickly, but it was, indicated that Atlanta, a return to Atlanta, Houston, and Quebec City, of course, were mentioned as possible cities. Do you see the NHL expanding in the next 5 to 10 years at all, or are they kind of happy with where they're at right now?
Well, they literally have billions of reasons to do it. And the billions being, the kind of figures they might get on the next expansion franchises. I think that at some point in time, this is going to be more of a hot button issue. Might be a little premature right now, although, I will note that when Gary Bettman was asked generally about expansion, he mentioned the interest and then mentioned those cities that you list there, Atlanta, Houston, and Quebec City, is having interest. So he's sort of confirming those cities are at least under some degree of consideration, or the league is aware of that interest. And when you look at the last 2 teams to enter the league, in the Vegas Golden Knights and Seattle Kraken, Vegas entered with a $500 million price tag for the expansion fee. Seattle, it went to $650 million. I would imagine whenever the next teams, when the league gets to expanding again, the price is going to be significantly higher. And that money gets divided entirely among owners. It's not shared with the players in what's called hockey-related revenue. So, I think that at some point in time, this is going to become a more pressing issue, and the league will be compelled to, just because of the financial ramifications of that decision. I just came away, right now thinking that it's not, maybe a little early for us to be talking about teams 33 and 34 joining this league.
CJ, I'm going to put you in Gary Bettman's shoes. If you're a commissioner, I'm going to give you one season, give you a full season. In terms of your priority list, what's number one?
When it comes to expansion, or just as a general idea?
As a commissioner in general.
Well, here's where Gary Bettman and I are different. I would change the playoff format. I personally think that this current format has some obvious problems in it. I think we're seeing top teams every year have to play each other sooner in the playoffs than they would. And, look, if you're a GM, it's probably, you're not incentivized to speak out against that, because it looks like maybe you're making excuses for your team and all those things. But, I just think as a fan, having the first and fourth overall teams in the entire NHL play in the first round, which we've seen in the past, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think that going even just to a simple conference format would address that. But that would be my pulpit, but maybe that's a moot point, because as I say, I'm yelling into the wind here, as are a lot of people on hockey Twitter, and Sidney Crosby and anyone else who's been hitting the drum on this issue.
Definitely supporter of that. Now let's go to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Ryan O'Reilly is expected to be back before the playoffs. Looking at the Leafs lineup, where do you think O'Reilly was slot in Game 1 against Tampa Bay?
Well, that's really the challenge with him breaking his finger when he did, and missing, what will be most of the rest of the regular season, is that the Leafs lose this time to experiment with that, right? And we'd seen in the games he played, he was primarily used on the second line. The Leafs did move John Tavares to the wing in those circumstances, or at least, most of the time that was what Sheldon Keefe seemed inclined to do. But Keefe had kind of indicated, maybe they try a bunch of different things. And we've actually seen Sheldon Keefe doing that with his lineup pretty much on a game by game basis. He's moving players around. So it makes it a little tougher to forecast, what's going to work best with O'Reilly. I would think because of the lack of time he's going to get to play with other players in the lineup, that having him start on the second line, when he does return, makes some sense, and kind of go from there. If there's one thing I'll say though, Sheldon Keefe is really a coach that doesn't get too married to his ideas, in the sense that, he does adjust in game and in series. I mean, pretty much every series we've seen him coach, behind the bench here with the Leafs, he's moved things around significantly when he's needed to. And that is really the beauty of the Ryan O'Reilly acquisition, I think, from Toronto's front office, is that, he adds a degree of flexibility. He can kill penalties. He can take faceoffs. He could play the wing if needed. He can handle center duties. I mean, even some of the players that they acquired down the lineup, like Noel Acciari, fits the same profile. And so, in this time where the Leafs at times are playing 11 forwards and 7 defensemen, you're going to see even more jumbling in that, matchup, because you don't have 4 full lines. So I think O'Reilly will probably be moved around, but with him missing so much of the end of the regular season here, it's probably starts with line 2 and goes from there.
Leafs goalie is obviously another massive talking point, at least in this market. Dubas actually mentioned at these GM meetings, he keep talking about Murray. I think when it's on the line, he'll be ready to go. A couple nights ago, Sheldon Keefe was talking about Murray's performance, saying he was great after letting him 4 goals once again. Do you get the sense that Dubas and the rest of the organization really want Matt Murray to be their number 1 guy come playoff time?
Well, they certainly want to build him up. I mean, he was brought here to play the biggest games. That's one thing he has over counterpart Ilya Samsonov, is a long playoff resume, as the goaltender of record for Pittsburgh's most recent 2 Stanley Cups. I know those are a fair bit in the rear view now, and Matt Murray's had all kinds of injury troubles. But, I think that there's a comfort level knowing that he's handled the biggest stages the game has to offer and delivered and played very well for the Penguins in those moments. And so, in a perfect world, as you draw it up on the board, I think you probably want him as your number 1. Now, the way the season's gone, at least Samsonov has played, exceptionally well. In fact, I think he's really done a nice job getting a number of starts for the Leafs. He's been pretty consistent in his performance. He doesn't have a whole lot of a playoff track record at the NHL level, but I think that they'll be comfortable with him if the decision goes there, that he's the one getting those starts. I mean, really the best formula here for the Leafs is that both players give them comfort. And so they're going to have to see here in the next 4.5 weeks from Matt Murray that he's healthy, that he gets his game back, because, I'm not resting it all on his shoulders, but he's allowed 4 goals in each of the 3 starts he's made after returning from his ankle injury. And so, I think what they're trying to do is keep the pressure off him, but try to build him up, boost him up, give him confidence, and have 2 options when it comes playoff time. But right now, I mean, they had to make the decision today. I think it would be difficult to start Matt Murray in game 1 of the playoffs, just because I think there's a little bit more confidence in what Samsonov's brought.
Yeah, Samsonov's been great. If you look at his home and away splits, he's been fantastic.
Fire,
so home ice is going to be important for the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's been Chris Johnston of NorthStar Bets. Chris, thanks. Let's do this again soon.
Yep, we'll talk next week.
Thank you.